Hey, I'm some nobody, and I want to talk about a horror icon. A character whose legacy includes permanently changing the way we view hockey masks. He held the record for most on-screen kills of any horror villain for almost 20 years, and he's also a really fun Mortal Kombat character. Yeah, that's right, I'm talking about Jason Voorhees today. So quick rundown on F-13. Jason was a young boy with severe mental and physical disabilities who drowned at Camp Crystal Lake because the counselors who were supposed to be watching him weren't. For decades after his drowning, Jason's mother Pamela returned to the camp to enact revenge on anyone who would dare try and reopen it, Scooby Doo style. Eventually, Pamela is defeated and beheaded. Then, 1 year after her death, Jason returns as a fully grown man to continue wreaking havoc in and around the Crystal Lake area. He gets knocked down, he gets up again. He gets killed. He becomes a zombie. He goes to New York, hell, Elm Street, and then the future. But how does Jason drown as a young boy, then grow up to be the brick shithouse he would become? Why is he so resistant to death even before he becomes a zombie? Well, there's no answers in the movies outside the Evil Dead's Necronomicon appearing in Part 9, but there are some ideas presented in the comics that I think are cool, and that's what we're talking about today. Keep in mind, the Friday the 13th series is a mess, timeline and lore wise. There's a ton of time skips and 2 tons of nonsense. After part 6, it really feels like the people behind the series were just throwing stuff at the wall to see what sticks. So I'm not going to be debating whether these comics are canon or not. I just think they're neat, so I'm going to talk about them. First comic I want to talk about is a 2007 6-issue run, simply titled Friday the 13th. Written by Jimmy Palmiotti and Justin Gray, the art done by Adam Archer and Peter Guzman. It's a very typical Friday the 13th movie in comic form. What makes it interesting is that halfway through the second issue, one of the characters goes outside and she sees these shadowy ghost figures hovering over the lake. In this comic run, Jason also goes out of his way to drag a few victims into the lake, and at the start of issue 5, this cop character explains that the bodies pulled from the lake are covered in bite marks from children of various ages. The obvious conclusion to draw here is that whatever these ghostly figures are, Jason is, quote unquote, feeding them. We aren't left in the dark for very long on what these shadowy figures are. At the very beginning of issue 6, we are shown the grisly scene of Crystal Lake in the year 1850. A group of settlers slaughtering Native Americans belonging to the Tillamook tribe, slitting their shaman's throat and throwing their bodies into the lake, leaving no survivors. For a century after the massacre, the vengeful spirits of the Tillamook claimed countless souls in an effort to find a perfect vessel for their hatred. They eventually found that vessel with Jason, but what makes him so special? He was just an innocent little boy who drowned due to negligence. He wasn't killed maliciously. Now, I'd like to pivot away from the 2007 comic to bring up another Friday the 13th comic released 1 year later in 2008. Written by Ron Mars and illustrated by Mike Huddleston, Friday the 13th Badland tells 2 stories in parallel. The story of a couple of young adults trying to take shelter at Camp Crystal Lake during a snowstorm, and the vastly more interesting story of 3 trappers in the colonial days stuck in a snowstorm who forcefully take shelter inside of a Native American family's wigwam. A wigwam is a dome-shaped tent that is Native American in origin. Inside the wigwam, there's a Native American woman feeding her baby who the men threaten. The men take the family's food, violate the woman, and ultimately wind up killing both the mother and her baby. The husband returns and he lunges at the men in a fit of rage, but is repelled by a shotgun blast to his face. Rather than dying on the spot, the native man is able to retreat back out into the storm. The trappers are left shaken and terrified by the husband's survival, and he quickly returns to enact his revenge on the evil men, killing them one by one with a supernatural strength and endurance. After avenging his family, the husband carries them into the lake and sinks to the bottom. I believe that the Tillamook spirits inhabiting the lake empowered the husband so that he could enact his revenge, but released his soul in the end because he didn't suit their needs as a vessel. Perhaps it's because his own rage wasn't great enough to bring him back from the dead over and over, the same way Jason's brings him back. I think that the ideal vessel for the Tillamook needs to have as intense a desire for revenge as the spirits themselves. A quick disclaimer. I'm going to be going over Pamela Voorhees' backstory in this next segment. I'll be going off of the Pamela Tapes version from the Friday the 13th game, but I'll be using images from the Pamela's Tale prequel comic written by Mark Andreyko and illustrated by Sean Mole and Christy Quinn, to serve as a visual aid. The Pamela's Tale comic makes a few changes that I don't really care for, like making young Jason torture animals, which I feel does a huge disservice to the tragedy of his drowning, so I prefer the Pamela tapes backstory. From the Pamela tapes, we learn that Jason's real father was an unknown man who forced himself on a teenaged Pamela, and she married Elias Voorhees, a burly and intimidating man, because of the fear this event instilled in her. Unfortunately, Elias Voorhees is a horrible and abusive man, and Pamela is urged to kill him by a voice in her head that she believes to be the unborn Jason. She goes to town on Elias's head with an axe while he's sleeping, in an act of self-defense if you believe that offense is the best defense. She promises Jason that she will never let anybody hurt them again. Pamela burns down the trailer, chucks Elias into the nearest body of water, and then she leaves Ohio. That's not a shitty Ohio meme. She is legitimately from Ohio. Eventually, Pamela winds up in the small town of Crystal Lake. She has Jason, she gets a job at a local diner, and eventually she's invited to come be the head cook at Camp Crystal Lake, where unfortunately, Jason would drown. Despite the unfortunate circumstances of Jason's conception, Pamela loved her son dearly, and when she lost him, you could say that she completely lost it. When Pamela's reign of terror on Camp Crystal Lake was finally ended by Alice in 1980, we see that Mrs. Voorhees died carrying enough rage that she is able to clench her hands into fists despite being decapitated. I believe that the Tillamook spirits inhabiting the lake could sense this undying rage from Pamela and used it to resurrect Jason, to make a vessel for their rage and Pamela's. You could argue even after Jason's second death at the hands of Tommy Jarvis, Pamela's rage would remain undying, as the paramedic Roy Burns would sort of become Jason in his mind to enact his own revenge. And then following the death of Roy Burns, Tommy Jarvis himself would begin to feel these dark influences to don the hockey mask. Huh. Maybe Jason Goes to Hell was actually ahead of the curve on all this, making Jason this undying figure who permanently jumps from body to body because Pamela's rage can never be fully sated. Just maybe. Nah, that movie sucked.